Hello, I'm Ed Fuquay, young adult librarian extraordinaire here at Woonsocket Harris Public Library.
Solitaire Frisbee from the children's room.
And we're here continuing our conversation about Norse mythology. Now, last one was pretty bad. Things don't get much better because we're running the groundwork now, heading towards Ragnarok, the end of all things.
Okay.
There's a lot that happens before Ragnarok. Now, Odin had wandered the earth. He had given up an eye. He had spent 9 days hanging on the world tree to learn the secrets of the earth and the future, and mostly Ragnarok.
Mm-hmm.
So he knew there were certain things that were going to happen at Ragnarok, things that were destined to be. And one of them was that Frey, the Vanir god who had joined the Aesir, Frey was destined to fight Surtur, the fire giant.
Okay.
Now, Odin wasn't bothered by that because Frey had a secret weapon, a magic sword, which some called Sumarbrander. And I'm phrasing it like that because in the actual myths, the sword doesn't seem to have a name, although most things in Norse mythology do, so it's bothered people for a long time that Frey's magic sword didn't have a name. Rick Riordan uses Sumarbrander in what's called Sword of Summer in one of his Magnus Chase books. He has a title of one book actually is The Sword of Summer. So the sword plays a big part in it. And the name sounds so right. I've seen it on several websites, but I can't find an actual source of mythology where it's ever called that. So it's possible Rick Riordan made it up. In any event, we'll call this sword Sumarbrander, the Sword of Summer. And because it was a fire sword, it was the one thing in the universe that could stop Surtur.
Who was the fire?
The fire giant.
Giant.
Yep.
Would we recognize him in any other?
He was in the last Thor movie, Ragnarok.
Okay.
He's the big red guy surrounded by flames.
Okay.
The one that captures Thor and dangles him like a yo-yo. Yeah.
Okay.
That was Surtur, or Surt he's also called. So Odin was feeling okay about that part of the end of the world. However, there's a lot of things that the gods can't count on, including the vagrancy of their hearts. So Frey was dissatisfied. He had everything a god could want, but he still wanted more. This wasn't enough for him. So he waited until Odin was off in Valhalla training his immortal warriors for the final fight. And he snuck onto Thor's magic throne. Now, Odin's magic throne. Odin had a throne where he could sit in it, and he could see all the world laid out before him. He could see anyone and everything in the world on it if he concentrated enough.
He had this prior to the hanging for the 9 days?
He probably got it afterwards.
Okay.
No one really knows where the throne came from. It's a magic throne, extremely powerful. And so Frey sat down in that to try to find what was missing from his life. And so he searched far and wide across the face of the earth. And whatever he saw troubled him so much that when he came out of it, he was extremely depressed. He couldn't eat or sleep or drink. He was just miserable. So all of his servants got together and they said, well, we have to do something about this. So Skirnir, who was one of the light elves, who was basically his butler, his major domo. Skirnir says, I will go talk to him. So sits down with Frey and asks what's wrong. And Frey says, well, I've seen my heart's desire. The woman I desire more than anything in the world. Her name is Gerd. She's a giantess. She is so beautiful, so well-shaped, so passionate. She's the only one for me. Now, part of the problem with this is, since he joined the Aesir, Frey has been doing a lot of fighting giants. And in one version of the story, he's actually killed Gerd's brother. So he knows this isn't going to go very well for him. So he says, if I go to her, it'll be disastrous. So Skirnir, you must go to her and give her my word. Convince her to come to me. And so Skirnir says, well, that's a big task. And Frey says, I will give you anything you desire. And he says, anything? So Frey says, yes. And so immediately Skirnir asks for the magic sword, Sumarbrander. And so Frey doesn't want to lose it, but he's really in love with Gerd.
Wow.
So he gives up his magic sword to his butler, basically.
That's impressive.
And he takes the magic sword and rides off back to Jotunheim, the land of the giants, and he locates her. And in some version of the story, he drops to one knee and waxes poetically about how deeply in love Frey is and how passionate Frey is for her. There's a version of the story in which he actually threatens her. He threatens her with a horrific curse that she will not have Frey, she will have no other man, and no woman will ever speak to her, and she'll have to live in a little shack by the edge of the world.
Gosh.
Which is a really horrible curse. That's not in every version, so. But one way or another, Gerd finally says yes, and she agrees to meet with Frey in a grove of trees in 9 days. So Skirnir sends word back to meet with Gerd in this grove of trees, and then he immediately scarfers off to Alfheim, the land of the elves, because he's not going to risk going back to Asgard with the stolen sword in his scabbard. So Skirnir disappears from our story and is never seen again. So Frey is facing, eventually, Ragnarok will come. And at some point, he's really going to wish he had that magic sword. There's a lot of things, like I said, that have to happen before Ragnarok occurs. And figuring out what that was basically Odin's main job. Now, there's a big thing that was going to happen. And that would lead to a second big thing that was going to happen. And these were things that Odin was on the lookout for. Now, once these things happen, most of the Norse myths take place before these things. These things are written down as if they've already happened. But again, most of the myths we know can't take place after these things occur. The first thing that happens to Balder. Now, Balder was the god of light. He was the god of the sun. He was beautiful, Balder. Everybody loved him. He was the nicest guy you'd ever want to meet. However, he was troubled. He had a series of dreams. He dreamed he saw sheets of fire burning the earth, and he saw brother fighting against brother and blood flowing like water. And every time he woke up, it troubled him. And he couldn't shake these dreams that would come to him every night. And so Odin, who knows a thing or two about dreams, highly suspected what was up. So he went down to the earth and he put his cloak on and he pulled his slouch hat over his face. He wandered the face of the earth. In fact, when someone asked him who he was, he said, "I am Wander, the son of Warrior." And so he asked around about the most powerful seeress in the world who could interpret these dreams for him. He was eventually told of one, and they said, "Oh, she can interpret any dream. The problem is she's dead." Odin says, Wanderer says, "Not a problem." So he rides out to her grave, and it takes a while. She lives, according to one story, at the very edge of the world where the earth drops off into an endless ocean. And there he finds this grave. So he performs a complex ritual. He sacrifices something, we don't know what. He spills blood, he does a ritual, and her shade comes back. And as she appears there, he greets her with the phrase, "What is the news from the land of the dead?" And she says, "Balder is coming. We have brewed mead for him. And there'll be mourning in the world. In the land of the dead, there will be only laughter." And he knows then that Balder's doom has been written. So, but Odin's not one to give up without a fight. So having gotten this explanation of the dream, this prediction, he immediately rides back to Asgard and he talks to Frigga. Now, Balder was the son of Odin and Frigga. And Frigga loves her son very much. So Odin comes to her with all this, and Frigga says, "A mother knows what to do. I will take care of this." And so Frigga took an oath from everyone not to harm Balder. Everyone had to swear not to harm Balder, and then she wandered the earth and she got the oath from everything that existed. Iron had to swear not to be made into a knife to stab him. Wood had to swear not to be made into like a shield or something like that, or a club to hit him over the head with. She made every living thing and non-living things swear that they would not harm Balder. The only thing she missed was mistletoe. Because let's face it, mistletoe isn't even a real plant. It's a parasite. It clings to the outside of oak trees. It just looks annoying and gets in people's way. So she comes back to Asgard and tells her husband, "We don't have to worry. Balder is safe from now until the end of time." So they explain to Balder what they've done, and he's kind of amazed by this. And so, Tyr, the god of war, says, "Well, let's test it." He pulls out his sword and swings at him, and it just doesn't hit him. It just sort of veers away from him. And so news gets around as one by one all the gods show up and they start tossing things at him and wood disintegrates instead of smashing into him. It's like he's completely invulnerable. So again, word gets around and the gods are all having this huge party where they throw things at Balder. As happens, these parties tend to get out of hand. Now, Odin had a lot of kids. One of his other children by Frigga was named Hod, who was blind. He was Hod the Blind. And he hears all this commotion and he asks what's going on. So a friendly, helpful Loki says, oh, well, they're all testing their weapons against Balder the Brave, who cannot be harmed. And Hod said, well, if only I could join in. Loki says, oh, you can. I will point you in the right direction and I'll even give you a weapon. Here, have this small dart. It's so tiny, it couldn't even harm Balder, even if he wasn't completely invulnerable. And so he steers, through the rest of the drunken and, weapon-tossing gods in front of Balder, and Hod brings back his army, throws a spear through the air, which, wouldn't you know it, was made of mistletoe. And so Hod hears the whole room go really quiet and says, what's wrong? And then he hears his mother Frigga wailing. And when he cries out, Balder is dead. So it is extremely tragic. Loki immediately hightails it out of there.
I have to say, I very much can relate to Frigga, you said, as your mom.
Yeah.
Yeah, as a parent, you try to cover all the bases and do everything.
Yeah. You try, but you always forget that one thing that turns around and bites you. So they had a huge funeral, a big Viking funeral for Balder. They filled up a boat with his body and all of his valuable possessions, and everybody brought things to be sacrificed onto the fire. Odin even put in Draupnir, the armband that produces like 8 other golden bands every 9 days. And even the giants showed up, and the dwarves showed up. Because everybody loved Balder. He was the god of the sun, and there's a lot of talk like, well, without him, who's going to balance out the solstices and the equinoxes and everything? And after the eclipse, who's going to reignite the sun? We kind of need Balder for that. There was a giantess who showed up named Herakin. And Herakin was a powerful being that lived. She arrived in Asgard riding on a giant wolf, using live vipers as the reins of the wolf. And when they're trying to push Balder's boat out into the water to set it on fire, it is so heavy and laden with gold that they can't move it. So she comes up and plants her big foot against it and shoves it, and she shoves it so hard to go shooting out into the lake, and even the wooden rollers that the thing is sitting on catch fire because they spin so fast with the boat going across it. And then she vanishes from our story. Despite sounding really super cool, we never hear from Herakin again. She's easily worth her own spin-off myth. But for whatever reason, she pops out of nowhere, does this one cool thing, and then disappears from Norse mythology forever. Yeah, Herakin. But someone who rides a giant wolf using vipers as reins is just got to be mentioned,
Right.
You just can't ignore her. So, Balder's wife also dies of grief. The boat is set on fire, but no sooner has it caught fire, Viking funeral, Odin already has a plan. He's not going to little thing like this interfere with his schemes, because he's Odin. So he contacts Hermod. He's Hermod the Swift, or in some translations, Hermod the Nimble. He's the fastest of all the Norse gods. So Odin gives him Sleipnir, the 8-legged horse, whose interesting origin we heard about last week.
We did.
So Sleipnir is the fastest horse in the land, and he says, ride to the land of the dead, go to Helheim, and petition Hela to return Balder. And so Hermod leaps on the back of Sleipnir and rides. And so this is a storytelling piece. He goes on to the different lands that he passes through and so forth, that we can just, skim over. Eventually, after many trials and tribulations, he arrives at the land of the dead, where the sun never rises and so forth and so on. He sees this bright shining light, and it's Balder and his wife, who are both there in the land of the dead. But as he approaches them, he runs into Hela. And Hela is the Norse goddess of death, Loki's daughter, by the giantess Angerboda. Now, Hela, as you may recall, half of her body was a beautiful, voluptuous woman, and half of her body was a decaying corpse.
Mm-hmm.
So Hermod comes up and he drops to one knee and he says, "You must release Balder the Brave from captivity here." And she says, "But he is the most beautiful thing in my realm. Why should I let him go?" He says, "Well, we cannot survive without Balder. He is so mourned, everything in the world weeps for Balder." And Hela kind of fixes him with her one good eye and says, "I don't believe that's true. I'll tell you what, I'll release Balder if everything in the world weeps for him. But if not, he will stay with me forever." And so Hermod realizes that's the best deal he's going to get from her, and leaps back on Sleipnir and goes riding back and back and back across all the different worlds till he gets back to Asgard and lays out what happened. And all the gods say, "Yeah, that's doable." So they have to contact. It just as Frigga contacted everything in the universe to agree not to harm Balder. They now have to make sure that everybody is sufficiently depressed and crying over Balder's death, which they do. Being the Norse gods, they travel the universe and they talk to every person and discover that they're all crying. The trees are weeping, the stones are weeping. That was how beloved Balder was. And so they gather together again. Everybody reports back and says, "Yes, I went to such and such a country, and all these people were weeping, and these people were weeping," and so forth and so on. So they gather together their notes, and then they realize they're near the mouth of a cave, and there's an old woman inside the cave. And she says, "Well, I'm not crying for Balder," and they're shocked. And they say, "How can you not weep for him?" And the old lady says, "Oh, he wasn't all that. He never did anything for me." And she hobbles back into her cave, and they all go, and realizing what that means. She will not weep for Balder. And then one of them says, "You know, that old lady looked kind of familiar. Didn't she sound a little bit like Loki?" Yeah. And the gods realize they've been tricked, and Loki alone will not weep for Balder and will not bring him back from the grave, which is pretty much the last straw. Thor once again grabs his hammer and shouts, "Loki!" A shout I think I've done every week for the last 4 or 5 weeks. And Loki realizes he may have gone too far. He may have actually pushed the envelope too much this time. All of a sudden, his jokes aren't funny anymore. So he has a cabin that has 4 doors, one facing in each direction, so he can see anyone coming towards him. And it isn't long before he sees essentially a lynch mob of Norse gods marching towards him. He thinks, "All right, I can deal with this. I'm Loki." So he can shapeshift. So he goes out and he sees a stream near his house, and so he dives into the stream and he changes into a salmon. Because salmon are notoriously difficult to catch.
Okay.
So he's swimming and he's swimming and he's swimming, and he gets away from them. They don't notice him. Mm-hmm. And he comes out of the water exhausted, changes back into Loki again, and he's applauding himself on his cleverness, because everyone knows that not even the gods can capture a salmon in the middle of a stream. It just can't be done. He thought, but if it could be done, how would I do it? So he thought about it for a while. He goes, "Oh, I know what I do." And he grabbed a bunch of thin vines and started weaving them together until he'd made this structure with holes running through it. And he says, "I'll call this a net." That would work. And then he hears the hounds baying and goes, "Oh crap!" And so he throws the net onto the fire, and immediately changes back into a salmon and dives back in again. So the gods are coming along, and they find where he's made his encampment. And wouldn't you know it, the gods have noticed that weird pattern in the ashes. The ashes make a kind of a checkerboard pattern, like there was something there that Loki had burned. So very carefully they grab some more vines and they recreate from the ashes of what Loki had left behind and create the world's first fishing net, well, technically second. And with that, they drag the bottom of the river. This goes back and forth a while because salmon are extremely strong and fast swimmers. He leaps over the net. They have to go back upstream and catch him again, and so forth and so on. Eventually, he gets caught. And they drag him out of the water. He changes back into Loki, and basically he sees the looks on their faces, and he realizes his silver tongue is not going to help him this time. This is going to be bad, very bad. This is kind of like the point of no return. So the gods take him down to Midgard, Earth, and they go into a cave where he's cut off from Asgard and the stars and everything. And they have his wife Sigurd and 3 of his sons, his human sons, by Sigurd. And he had tricked Hod into killing his brother Balder. And so what they do is they take one of Loki's sons and change him into a wolf. As a wolf, he becomes crazed with bloodlust and attacks his own brother and kills him. And then Loki, they take the remains of the son that died, and Loki is bound with the intestines of his dead son. It's really horrific even for Vikings. This is really awful, and they're not even done with him yet. So Loki is bound inside this cave, and they have a giant snake that wraps around the stalactites of the cave, and his mouth, his gaping jaws are over Loki's face, and the venom drips down and strikes Loki and burns him like acid, and he screams. And when he twists around trying to escape, it causes earthquakes in Midgard. His wife Sigrun is there, and she has this bowl that will catch the venom. When the bowl gets filled, though, she has to go away and dump it and come back again. And during the time that Loki's being hit by the venom, he causes more earthquakes. Now, Odin knows all this is happening. He does not stop it. It may be that he can't stop it. Because this is the point of no return. So Thor comes back and says, "We've done it. We've finally bound Loki. So there'll be no more trouble from him. Everything's going to be fine." Things are not fine. Because Odin knows the first two things that are going to happen before the end of the world is Balder will die and Loki will be bound. There were several other Norse myths in which someone casually mentions Loki's binding. Mm-hmm. For instance, in the flighting of Loki, when he teases one of the goddesses, she shoots back, "Well, you will be bound with your own son's intestines," which should have given him a hint.
Wow. But
somehow it still surprised Loki. So the Norse storytellers were dropping hints. This was going to come. And it was so inevitable, Odin couldn't stop it. Theoretically, if he had saved Loki, he could have held off Ragnarok. But he wouldn't or couldn't do that. It had to happen, and it did. So Loki is bound and can cause no more mischief. But the earth still rises every time he's in agony. But Odin knows now there's no turning back. It's all going to come to a head, and probably sooner rather than later. And all of his planning and all of his scheming, it all comes down to this, as they say in the Hollywood blockbusters. And we'll find out next time what's going to happen.
Are you kidding me?
Yes, that's a cliffhanger.
You got me.
Yeah. Theoretically, all the Norse myths are building up to this. They drop hints about things happening. At one point, Odin is told something will only happen after Loki breaks his bonds. And he goes, Loki's never been, tied up significantly. Mm-hmm. So Odin knew years before Loki was going to be bound and escape one day.
Right.
Apparently it's one of those things that has to happen. Although Odin did quite a bit to try to stop it, he failed.
Interesting.
Yeah. And how much the gods are controlled by destiny and how much free will they have is one of those eternal questions that the Norse myths, ask us. Mm-hmm. Did believing it was going to happen stay Odin's hand and keep him from interfering when he could have? Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't know.
And it's relatable.
Yeah.
We experience those same questions in our own lives.
Yeah, the Vikings were fatalistic. They believed that sometimes, you were doomed and there was nothing you could do and you had to accept that. But they also were very firm believers in free will, of pushing the boundaries and things like that. Both those beliefs simultaneously ran through Viking thought, and we see that mirrored perfectly in their mythology.
I can get that.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued.
Yeah, we'll find out what happens next week.
Sounds good.
All right, until then, I've been Ed.
Solitaire.
Take care and be safe.